Sir, are you lost? The question hung in the frigid New York air like an accusation wrapped in false politeness. André Rieu stopped mid-step on the red carpet leading to Lincoln Center's David Geffen Hall, turning slowly to face the security guard whose badge read Zephyr. The young man's eyes swept dismissively over André's worn coat, his weathered shoes, his humble appearance. "I'm here for the gala," André replied calmly, his hands finding the invitation in his pocket. Zephyr's expression didn't change. "This is an exclusive black tie event, sir. Individuals without appropriate attire are not permitted inside." The words came rehearsed, automatic, spoken dozens of times that cold November evening in Manhattan. A few seconds passed where nobody around noticed the mistake. Guests continued flowing past them. Laughter echoed from inside. Camera flashes illuminated the winter night. André stood there in silence, holding his invitation and being treated like someone who didn't belong. What nobody knew was that at that exact moment, someone inside had already noticed the guest of honor wasn't present. And when that person began walking toward the entrance, everything was about to spiral completely out of control. The evening progressed in the heart of Manhattan, and the cold made every minute outside increasingly uncomfortable. The red carpet continued receiving important guests, while André Rieu remained several feet from the main entrance, casually observed as someone out of place. To those hurrying past, he was just another poorly dressed man trying to approach an exclusive event. Inside the building, the atmosphere was completely different. The lobby was illuminated by towering chandeliers. The sound of elegant conversations mixed with clinking glasses as the orchestra finished tuning for the official start of the evening. Everything was proceeding according to plan, except for one detail that was beginning to trouble some people in the organization. André Rieu's name appeared at the top of the evening's program. He wasn't just a guest, he was the reason many were there. Some sponsors were already discreetly asking where he was. The delay was starting to draw attention, but nobody suspected the reason. Outside, Zephyr still waited for confirmation that never came. The radio on his shoulder crackled a few times, but no clear instructions were given. André maintained his calm demeanor. He didn't argue, didn't try to force his way in, didn't reveal who he was. He observed everything in silence, as if curious to see how far this situation would go. It was in this interval, between the discomfort outside and the growing expectation inside, that a staff member from the organization began hurrying toward the entrance. She carried a clipboard in her hands and the look of someone who realized something was too wrong to ignore. When she approached the door, the security guards didn't know yet, but that simple walk was about to completely change the tone of the evening. The wind from the Hudson River crossed the street and made André pull his old jacket a bit closer. It wasn't a gesture of excessive discomfort, just the reflex of someone who had stood there long enough to feel the cold in his bones. He observed the movement with quiet attention, as if watching a scene that required no immediate reaction. Guests kept arriving, men in expensive suits, women wrapped in long coats, brief laughter, decisive steps. Few looked directly at him. When they did, they quickly looked away. To them, André was simply someone who clearly didn't belong in that scenario. Zephyr adjusted the radio on his shoulder again. The crackling returned, followed by silence. The other guard, more experienced, kept his gaze steady, mentally repeating the protocol. Lists were lists. Clothing proved nothing, but didn't help either. "Sir, just another moment, please," Zephyr said, trying to sound polite, though already showing impatience. "We're checking." André nodded without complaint. He had experienced packed halls, endless applause, attentive gazes from thousands of people. A few minutes of waiting in silence didn't bother him. What really caught his attention was something else. The way nobody asked questions, only judged. On the other side of the glass doors, the climate was beginning to change. One of the sponsors walked to the head organizer and asked in a restrained tone if André Rieu had arrived yet. She replied that yes, he should be coming in at any moment. She said this with certainty. Without knowing, he stood just a few feet away, stopped by a detail as simple as a worn jacket. The orchestra interrupted rehearsal for a few seconds. The conductor consulted his watch. A delay of this type wasn't usual. Outside, André observed the reflection of the lights in the glass of the entrance. For a brief moment, he thought about turning around and leaving. Not from wounded pride, but from curiosity. He wanted to understand how far this situation would go without him saying a single word about who he was. It was then that the revolving door suddenly opened. A woman appeared hurriedly, with a clipboard in her hands and a tense face. Her eyes quickly swept the entrance, past the security guards, and stopped on him. She frowned like someone who recognizes something too late. "Wait a moment," she said, taking a step forward. And at that exact moment, André realized that the real impact of that evening hadn't even begun. The woman remained a few steps away from André. The thin heel echoed on the stone floor and drew the attention of Zephyr, who simultaneously turned around. She looked first at the worn jacket, then at his face, then at the clipboard she held too tightly. "How long has he been standing out here?" she asked, without taking her eyes off André. Zephyr cleared his throat before answering. "A few minutes. He said he was invited, but his name wasn't on the list." She closed her eyes for a second, like someone trying to control a problem before it exploded. When she opened them, the look was no longer of doubt, but of certainty. "Sir," she said now directly to André, her voice lower. "Are you André Rieu?" André didn't answer immediately. He only nodded slightly, almost out of politeness, as if confirming something obvious. The silence that followed was not long but heavy. The kind of silence that betrays a mistake too big to correct with a simple apology. The woman turned abruptly toward the security guards. "Do you have any idea who he is?" she asked without raising her voice, which made everything even more uncomfortable. Zephyr paled. "He wasn't dressed like—" She raised her hand, interrupting. "That doesn't matter." From inside, several people began walking toward the door, attracted by the tone of the conversation. A man in a dark suit recognized André and put his hand over his mouth, unbelieving. Another discreetly took out his phone. André observed everything without haste. There was no anger on his face, nor satisfaction, only attention, as if he were more interested in seeing how people reacted to the mistake than in the mistake itself. "Please, Mr. Rieu," the woman said, now visibly nervous. "Come inside. Everything is ready to receive you." André took a step forward, but stopped. He looked again at Zephyr, at the young guard who could barely hold his gaze, at the older one who maintained his rigid posture, but with a tense jaw. "Before I do that," André finally said with a calm but firm voice, "I'd like to understand something." Everyone remained motionless. "If I weren't who I am, how much longer would I have stood outside?" Nobody answered, and at that moment, André made a silent decision. A decision that had nothing to do with entering that event, and everything to do with what he would do after the doors would close. André's question hung in the air like something nobody there wanted to touch. Zephyr opened his mouth, closed it again, and seemed to search for an answer that wouldn't sound too ugly to say out loud. He couldn't find one. The woman with the clipboard took a deep breath. "Mr. Rieu, I take full responsibility for what happened. This shouldn't have happened." André nodded but didn't move. "I know it shouldn't have," he answered, "but it did. And that says more about this place than any beautiful speech inside there." Behind the glass doors, the lobby remained elegant, heated, full of laughter and clinking glasses. Outside, the cold remained the same. André still stood there, officially invited, officially expected, but not officially treated as someone who belonged in that space. Several guests began to whisper, "Is it really him? Why is he standing outside? This is going to cause problems." Zephyr swallowed. "Sir, I was just following protocol." André finally turned his gaze to him. "I know, and that's exactly what worries me." The woman closed the clipboard forcefully. "Let's resolve this now. You are the guest of honor this evening." André gave a small smile, brief, almost tired. Being a guest doesn't change what just happened. He then did something nobody expected. He took a half step backward, further from the entrance. "Before I go inside," he said, "I want you to do something." Everyone held their breath. "Open those doors and let everyone who's standing outside walk through without asking who they are, without looking at clothing, without checking the list for 5 minutes. The woman blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said. I want to see how this place functions when it can't choose who deserves to be inside." The silence became pure discomfort. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a mirror being placed exactly in the middle of the event. Zephyr hesitated. "Ma'am, this goes completely against protocol." André tilted his head slightly. "Then maybe it's time to test whether the protocol serves people, or people serve the protocol." Several guests began retreating from the door, clearly uncomfortable. Others came closer, too curious to leave. The woman with the clipboard looked around, noticed the raised phones, the attentive gazes, and understood that every decision there would have consequences. She nodded slowly. "Open the doors." The glass doors opened, and at that moment André Rieu still hadn't entered the event that bore his name. But something much bigger had already begun. The open doors immediately changed the climate. The cold air from the street entered the heated lobby, mixing two worlds that normally never touched. Outside, several people who were walking by slowed their pace, confused by the unusual scene. A man with a worn backpack hesitated before approaching. An older woman, simple coat and weathered shoes, stopped several feet behind, not understanding if this was really for her. The security guards looked at each other, uncertain, but kept the doors open. "You may come inside," said the organization woman, her voice too firm for someone clearly outside her comfort zone. "Everyone." The first to enter was the man with the backpack. He walked slowly like someone expecting to be stopped at any moment. Then came the lady, followed by a young couple who clearly had nothing to do with the event, but decided to follow the flow. Inside the lobby, murmurs grew. Several guests retreated, uncomfortable. Others observed in silence, trying to understand what this meant. Glasses were placed on tables. Conversations died mid-sentence. André remained outside. Nobody seemed to immediately notice this detail. The guest of honor hadn't yet crossed the threshold, while people who never would have passed reception were now inside, observed, judged, silently condemned. Zephyr walked over to André, his voice low. "Sir, you can come in now." André slowly shook his head. Not yet. He observed the lobby like someone witnessing an experiment. There was no provocation in his gaze, only attention. He wanted to see who stayed, who left, who pretended they saw nothing. An elegant woman, pearl necklace around her neck, whispered something irritated to her husband before heading toward the bar. A man in a light suit crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable, but in a corner, a waitress walked over to the lady who had just entered and offered her a glass of water without questions. André saw this and smiled for the first time that evening. The organizer walked over to him again. "Mr. Rieu, the hall is full. Everyone is waiting for you." "That's exactly why," he replied. "I haven't come inside yet." She frowned. "What are you trying to show?" André took a deep breath before answering. "That belonging isn't measured by clothing, invitations, or lists. If a place only functions when it chooses who gets to be seen, then it must be questioned." She remained silent. It was then that isolated applause sounded from somewhere in the hall. Just one person, then another. In a few seconds, more applause appeared, initially shy but growing. It wasn't for André yet. It was for what was happening. And at that moment, André realized that evening still had a turn in store that nobody was prepared for. The people who had entered through the open doors remained close to the entrance, still uncertain if they could walk further. The man with the backpack held it tightly, his eyes quickly scanning the luxury decorations, the crystal chandeliers, the tables covered with white linen. The older woman smoothed her coat, a gesture of discomfort that spoke of someone used to being invisible. Inside, reactions began to divide. A group by the bar demonstratively turned their backs to the entrance. A couple in evening wear discreetly left the hall, muttering about lack of respect for the event. But there were also others who kept watching, their faces more curious than rejecting. A young woman in a simple dress, clearly part of the catering staff, walked over to the old lady and said something kind. The lady smiled, a shy smile from someone not used to kindness from strangers. André observed all this from his position outside. Every reaction, every gesture, every change in the hall's climate was registered by him. This was no longer about him. This was about what people did when the rules suddenly changed. The organizer came to him for the third time, now with a different expression on her face. It was no longer just nervousness. There was something of understanding, perhaps even admiration. "Mr. Rieu," she said softly, "I'm beginning to understand what you're trying to achieve." "What do you understand?" André asked. "That this event may be more focused on exclusion than inclusion." André nodded slowly. "The most beautiful music I've ever heard wasn't played in palaces or theaters. It was played in squares, in parks, in places where everyone could listen." He looked at the people who had come through the doors. "Music doesn't choose who deserves to hear it. Why should we?" The question hung in the air. Inside, tension began to shift. The first shock of the unexpected gave way to something else. Some guests began cautiously talking with the newcomers. A man in a tuxedo asked the man with the backpack where he was from. A woman in an evening gown offered the old lady a chair. They were small gestures, but they changed the dynamics. Zephyr, who had initially stopped André, now stood several feet away, his face a mask of internal conflict. He had done his job, followed protocol, and yet that protocol had missed something fundamentally important. He walked over to André. "Sir," he said, his voice lower than before. "I'm sorry. I should have looked better." André turned to him. "You looked exactly as you were trained to look. That's the problem." Zephyr nodded, not sure what to say. At that moment, something unexpected happened. An older man in an elegant suit, clearly one of the evening's important guests, came walking outside. He walked directly to André. "Mr. Rieu," he said, "I'm Augustus Blackwell, one of the organizers of this event. May I say something?" André gestured for him to continue. "In all my years of organizing events like this, I've seen a lot, but what you just did reminded me of something important I had forgotten." "And what's that?" André asked. "That the value of an event isn't measured by who we exclude, but by who we welcome." He looked back at the hall. "We built this event around exclusivity, but maybe we made the wrong things exclusive." André listened silently. Augustus continued, "Would you still come inside? Not as a guest of honor claiming his privileges, but as someone who helps us make this into something better." It was an invitation, but also an acknowledgement, an admission that something fundamental had gone wrong, not just that evening, but perhaps for much longer. André looked at the open doors, at the people inside, at the people outside who were still watching, and then he made a decision nobody had seen coming. André looked at Augustus Blackwell with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't angry, not triumphant. It was something else, something that felt like weariness mixed with determination. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "I appreciate your words, but if I go inside now, that changes nothing about what happened here." Augustus frowned slightly. "But we opened the doors, as you asked." "Yes," André nodded. "But for how long? 5 minutes, 10? And then the doors close again and everything returns to how it was?" The question was direct, uncomfortable. Augustus hesitated before answering. That's a reasonable concern." André looked around at the hall where the newcomers still remained close to the entrance, as if they felt their presence was temporary, tolerated, not welcomed. "Look at them," André said. "They're inside. But do they feel welcome? Does anyone make them feel welcome?" It was a truth nobody wanted to acknowledge. The old lady with the worn coat now stood beside a table, her hands folded in front of her chest, clearly uncomfortable. Nobody had directly asked her to leave, but the looks, the whispers, the subtle distance others created, these were all signals that spoke without words. André took another step backward, further from the entrance. "I'm not going inside," he said decisively. The organizer, who had been following the conversation, hurried forward. "Mr. Rieu, please, the orchestra can't start without you. The sponsors, the press. The orchestra has been playing for hundreds of years without me," André interrupted calmly. "They can do it tonight too." "But you're the reason most people are here." André nodded slowly. "Exactly. And that's why I have to do this." He looked at the security guards, the organizers, the guests now gathered by the doors. "If I go inside and pretend nothing happened, what does that teach? That people can be excluded, humiliated, ignored, as long as the important guest eventually does his performance?" The silence that followed was heavy. "No," André said. "That's not the message I want to leave." He turned around and began walking away from the building. The reaction was immediate. People began shouting. Some tried to stop him. The organizer ran after him, her heels clicking on the sidewalk. "Mr. Rieu, please, think of the people who came to see you." André stopped and turned around. "I am thinking of them. I'm thinking of the older lady who was shut out because her coat wasn't good enough. I'm thinking of the man who worked his whole life and still isn't welcome in a place like this. I'm thinking of all the people who are judged before they even get a chance to be seen." He pointed to the building. "This event is built on wrong foundations. And until those foundations change, I can't be part of it." Augustus came forward. "What do you want then? What can we do to make this right?" André thought for a moment. "Change the rules, not just for tonight, but permanently. Make this a place where everyone is welcome, not just those with the right clothing or the right name." That's a big change," Augustus said. "Big problems require big changes," André replied. At that moment, something unexpected happened. The old lady who had come inside walked outside. She walked directly to André. "Sir," she said with a soft, trembling voice, "I don't know who you are, but I want to thank you." André looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For seeing me. In all the years I've walked through this city, nobody ever really looks at me. But tonight, I was seen." Her eyes filled with tears. "That's worth more than being inside any hall." André felt something in his chest break and heal at the same time. This was why he did what he did. Not for fame, not for applause, but for moments like this. He gently took her hand. "You were always seen, just not by the right people." The woman smiled, wiped away her tears, and nodded. Behind her, more people began coming outside. The man with the backpack, the young couple. And then, to everyone's surprise, some of the well-dressed guests began walking outside too. A woman in an evening gown walked to André. "Mr. Rieu, I know who you are, and I want to tell you that what you did tonight is more beautiful than any music." More people began joining her, a growing group gathering outside the hall. The organizer looked around, clearly panicked. The event was falling apart, but not in a way she could have predicted. Augustus stood beside her, but his expression was different. He didn't look worried. He looked inspired. "We have to do something," the organizer whispered. "Yes," Augustus said, "but not what you think." He walked to the middle of the gathered group and raised his voice. "May I have everyone's attention?" The crowd became quiet. "Tonight something happened that shouldn't have happened. We excluded someone based on appearance, and in doing so we forgot what this event should really be about." He looked at André. "This man reminded us that music, art, beauty, they're for everyone, not just for those with the right clothing or invitations." He took a deep breath. "Therefore, as co-organizer, I'm making this decision. Starting tonight, this event changes. There will be no more dress codes, no exclusive lists. The doors will be open to everyone who wants to hear music." A murmur went through the crowd. "Some of you won't appreciate this," Augustus continued, "and that's fine. But we have a choice to make between exclusivity and humanity. And tonight, I choose humanity." He turned to André. "Mr. Rieu, would you help us make this change? Not as guest of honor, but as a partner in building something better." André looked at the faces around him. The old lady who was smiling, the man with the backpack who stood upright, the young waitress who was applauding. And then he looked at the hall where the orchestra still waited. He nodded slowly. "But not in there," he said, pointing to the building. "Where then?" Augustus asked. André turned around and pointed to the street, to the open plaza in front of Lincoln Center. "Here, where everyone can listen." And at that moment, everyone realized the evening had just taken a completely new direction. The plaza in front of Lincoln Center was never intended for a concert. There were no seats, no amplifiers, no stage, only the cold stones, the historic facades around them, and the winter air of New York above. But within minutes, the plaza began to transform. Someone from the orchestra brought out a portable amplifier. A technician followed with cables. Musicians began carrying their instruments outside, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. The old lady found a place on the steps of an adjacent building. The man with the backpack sat beside her. The young couple remained standing, hand in hand, waiting. Inside the hall was chaos. Some sponsors left angrily, muttering about unprofessional behavior and broken contracts. Others stayed, curious about what would happen. The press photographed everything, their cameras clicking like a metronome of change. Augustus stood in the middle of the hall, speaking with the remaining organizers. His voice was calm but decisive. "This is the right thing to do," he said. "We have the chance to create something meaningful. Let's not waste it because we're afraid of change." One of the organizers shook his head. "The sponsors will never support us again." "Maybe not these sponsors," Augustus replied, "but there are other people who believe in what we're trying to build." Outside, André began tuning his violin. The cold air made the instrument temperamental. The strings responded slower than normal. He did it methodically, without haste, as if time stood still. People began gathering in the plaza, not just those who had come from the event, but also passers-by, curious about the unusual scene. A man on a bicycle stopped and remained watching. A couple coming out of a restaurant walked closer. A violinist from the orchestra came to stand beside André with her own instrument. "Mr. Rieu," she said softly, "the orchestra wants to play with you. Here outside." André looked at her, surprised. "You don't have to do this." "We know," she replied, "but we want to, because you reminded us why we became musicians. Not for the beautiful halls or the important audiences, but for the music itself." Slowly, more musicians came outside. First a few, then more, until almost the entire orchestra stood in the plaza, their instruments ready, their faces full of determination. The conductor came last, a smile on his face. "Well," he said to André, "this will be interesting." André laughed, a real laugh that broke the tension of the entire evening. "Let's play something simple," he said, "something everyone knows." The conductor nodded. "Ode to Joy. Perfect." They took their positions, not in neat rows like in a concert hall, but spread across the plaza among the people who had come to watch. André raised his violin, and then the music began. The first notes floated across the plaza, vulnerable in the open air, without the perfect acoustics of a concert hall. But there was something purer about this sound, something more authentic. People stopped walking. Conversations ceased. Even the city seemed to become quiet for a moment. The old lady on the steps closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. This was the first time in years she had heard music that didn't come from a phone or radio, but was played live in front of her. The man with the backpack stood upright, his entire posture changed. He was no longer someone trying to be invisible. He was someone who had the right to experience this moment. The young couple began dancing slowly, their movements simple but full of meaning. Inside the hall, the remaining guests came to the windows. Some opened them, letting the music flow inside. The difference was clear. Outside was freedom. Inside felt like a cage. One by one, the guests began coming outside. First hesitantly, then with more confidence. They left the warmth and comfort of the hall to be part of something they didn't yet fully understand, but intuitively felt was important. Augustus stood on the threshold, watching what was happening. The organizer beside him whispered, "We're losing everything." "No," he replied, "we're winning something much more important." The music grew. The orchestra played as if their lives depended on it. André led them not with exaggerated gestures, but with simple, clear signals. This wasn't a performance, this was communication. This was what music had always been meant to be. When the piece ended, there was first silence. Then applause exploded across the plaza. People clapped, cried, laughed, embraced strangers. It was a moment of collective catharsis, of liberation from rules they didn't even know they were following. André lowered his violin and looked around. "This," he thought, "is why I make music. Not for the concert halls or the reviews, but for these moments of pure human connection." He saw the old lady stand up and come toward him. She took his hand, said nothing, just nodded. No words were needed. Zephyr, who had earlier stopped him, stood at the edge of the crowd. He came forward, his face a mask of emotion. "Sir," he said, his voice thick, "thank you for teaching me what really matters." André smiled and patted him on the shoulder. The days following that evening in the plaza in front of Lincoln Center were filled with reactions, some hostile, others supportive, but all intense. The traditional sponsors withdrew exactly as predicted. Some newspapers wrote negative pieces about destroying decades of tradition. Others praised the courage of Augustus Blackwell and André Rieu for trying something new. But the most meaningful reactions didn't come from sponsors or newspapers. They came from ordinary people. A week later, Augustus received a letter from the old lady who had sat on the steps. She wrote about how that evening had reminded her of her youth, when music was simply part of life, instead of something that happened behind closed doors. She ended the letter with a simple question: "When is the next concert?" That question became the spark for something new. Augustus organized a meeting with the remaining organizers, several interested musicians from the orchestra, and André. They met in a small cafe instead of a conference room, a deliberate choice to set the tone. "We can't go back to how it was," Augustus began, "but we also can't continue without a clear plan." André nodded. "It's not just about a single event, it's about a philosophy, about how we make music accessible to everyone." Juniper, the violinist, leaned forward. "What if we organize a series of outdoor concerts, not just in New York, but in different neighborhoods, different cities? Without admission fees," another orchestra member added, "or with pay-what-you-can pricing. People pay what they're able to." Augustus took notes. "We'd need new sponsors, people who believe in this vision. Or maybe we don't need sponsors as we knew them, André said. Maybe we can keep it smaller, more authentic. Not every concert has to be a major event. The discussion went on for hours. Ideas flew back and forth, some practical, others idealistic, but all born from genuine conviction. Eventually, a plan emerged. A series of monthly concerts at different locations across America. No dress codes, no exclusive lists, just music and people. The first concerts were small. A plaza in Chicago, a park in San Francisco, a street corner in Nashville. But slowly they grew, not necessarily in size, but in impact. Columnist Fenner Rhodes wrote a series of articles about these concerts, documenting not just the music but the stories of the people who came, the retired teacher who hadn't heard live music in years, the single mother who brought her children and watched them dance, the homeless veteran who for one evening felt part of society again. Filmmaker Sh Peterson made videos that went viral, not because they were professionally produced, but because they were real. They showed moments of joy, connection, humanity. André himself didn't play at every concert. That was never the goal. The goal was to create a movement larger than one person. Other musicians began organizing their own versions. Young violinists, pianists, entire chamber music ensembles began performing in unexpected places. The old lady, her name was Margareta Wilson, they discovered, became a regular attendee. She brought friends, other elderly people who felt isolated. Slowly she formed a community around the music. The man with the backpack, whose name was Eric Thompson, turned out to have been a musician himself before circumstances put him on the streets. At one of the later concerts, André asked him to play along. Eric's hands trembled when he accepted the violin, but as soon as he began to play, he transformed. For those moments, he wasn't a homeless man. He was a musician, an artist, someone with value. Lincoln Center itself underwent changes. Augustus eventually became director and gradually implemented new policies. There were special evenings where everyone was welcome, regardless of dress or financial means. Traditional concerts remained for those who valued them, but they were supplemented with more accessible options. Not everyone was happy with these changes. Some traditional patrons left the venue, complaining that it was losing its prestige. But for every person who left, 2 new people came who had never thought a place like Lincoln Center was for them. 1 year after that cold evening, Augustus organized a special event. It was a commemoration concert, played on exactly the same date in exactly the same plaza. André was there, of course, but he wasn't the only soloist. Eric played. Margareta sang a song she remembered from her youth. Children from a local school performed a piece they had learned. The crowd was enormous, much larger than that first evening, but the essence was the same. People coming together to experience music without barriers, without judgment. Before the concert began, André took the microphone. A year ago, I stood before the doors of a building where I wasn't welcome because of how I looked. That experience could have made me angry, bitter, but instead, it reminded me of something important. He looked around at the crowd. Music wasn't created to divide people. It was created to unite them. And when we build structures that divide instead of unite, those structures must change. He raised his violin. This concert isn't perfect. The acoustics aren't ideal, it's cold. There are no comfortable seats, but it's real, and that's what matters. The music that followed was indeed not perfect. Technically, there had been better concerts played in better conditions, but few concerts had more meaning. When it was over and the crowd began to disperse, Margareta stayed behind briefly. She walked to André. "Mr. Rieu," she said, "may I tell you something?" "Of course. When I sat on those steps that first evening, I hoped I could hear the music before I died. I hadn't heard live music in years, and I thought I never would again." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "But you gave me more than music. You reminded me that I matter, that my presence counts, and that has changed my final years." André felt his own eyes moisten. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me why all this is worthwhile." They embraced, these 2 people from completely different worlds who were connected by one moment of humanity. As André walked home that evening, he thought about the past year, the concerts, the stories, the changes. It hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, frustration, exhaustion, but then he remembered the faces. Margareta, Eric, the young mother with her dancing children, Zephyr, who had learned to look differently, Augustus, who had risked his career for an ideal, That evening, when he had stood outside a building, excluded because of his clothing, could have been painful. And it had been painful in a certain way. But that pain had birthed something valuable, a reminder that exclusivity isn't the same as excellence. That accessibility doesn't mean lowering standards. That humanity is always more important than protocol. The security guards at Lincoln Center still worked there, but they had learned to look differently, to see beyond appearances, to ask questions before making judgments. The organizers still organized events, but they now considered who they might be excluding instead of only focusing on who they were trying to include. The musicians still played, but they understood now that their audience wasn't limited to those who could afford tickets or who moved in the right circles. And André himself continued making music, but with a renewed purpose, a clear understanding that music is a force that transcends boundaries when we allow it to. That evening when he got home, he found a letter in his mailbox. No return address. Just a short message in simple handwriting. You taught me that it's okay to exist, to take up space, to be seen. Thank you. It was signed by nobody, but that didn't matter. It was signed by everyone whose life had been touched by what had happened. André carefully folded the letter and placed it in a drawer where he kept other meaningful things. Reminders of why he did what he did. That evening a year ago, when he had stood before closed doors, he had had a choice. He could have insisted on his status, used his name to get inside, swallowed the humiliation, and continued as if nothing had happened. But he had made a different choice, and that choice had changed everything. Not just for him, but for Margareta and Eric and thousands of others. For Lincoln Center, for the way people thought about music and accessibility. A simple choice, born from a moment of exclusion, had created a wave of inclusion that continued to expand, and that André realized was the real power of music. Not the notes themselves, but what they could inspire in people's hearts. Not the performance, but the connection. The movement that began that cold evening continued to grow. Within 2 years, plaza concerts, as they came to be known, were happening in over 50 cities across America. Each one was different, reflecting the local community and culture, but all shared the same core principle: music for everyone, without barriers. Universities began studying the phenomenon. Sociology professors wrote papers about community building through accessible arts. Music schools started incorporating community engagement into their curricula, teaching young musicians that their art could be a tool for social connection. The impact reached far beyond music. Other arts organizations began questioning their own practices. Museums started hosting open-door days. Theaters created programs for those who couldn't afford regular tickets. The simple question André had asked, "How long would I have stood outside?" became a lens through which institutions examined their accessibility. But perhaps the most profound change was in the individual stories. Thousands of people like Margareta and Eric found community, purpose, and dignity through music. Former addicts found healing in the shared experience of live performance. Isolated elderly people discovered friendship. Children from underserved communities saw professional musicians and dared to dream. André continued to perform in traditional venues. His career flourished rather than suffered, but he always returned to the plazas, the parks, the street corners. These performances, he often said, reminded him why he became a musician in the first place. 5 years later, when documentary filmmakers asked him if he regretted that cold evening outside Lincoln Center, André smiled. "Regret it? That was the most important performance of my life. I never played a single note, but I learned the most valuable lesson. That true artistry isn't about perfect acoustics or prestigious venues. It's about creating moments where human beings connect with beauty and with each other." The old security uniform that had once been a symbol of exclusion was now displayed in a frame in Augustus's office next to a photo of that first plaza concert. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder, a simple question mark made visible. Who are we excluding and why? And somewhere in New York, in a small apartment filled with memories, Margareta Wilson kept a program from that first concert. Not because it was historically significant, but because it represented the evening she learned she mattered. The evening music and humanity found their way back to each other. The revolution that began with a worn jacket and a closed door had become something beautiful. A world where music truly belonged to everyone who had ears to hear it and a heart to be moved.